rather than kind of dive into that question, how does Australia wield influence in an era where there is a growing contestation between the United States and China, I thought I would step back and start with kind of a broader question of how does a country like Australia, a nation like Australia, guarantee its own national security? Because this is one of the fundamental responsibilities of a government, of a nation state, to protect the people, to protect the sovereign rights of that nation. And as you all know better than most, right? For the first 100+ years of Australia's post-settlement era, that was not an issue. Right? Australia was part of the British Empire, and so there was no such thing as national security. There was security of the empire as a whole, and it was in that context. But really, for even 30 years after Federation, that wasn't much of an issue. I was actually shocked. 3 years ago now, I was in Washington, D.C. In 2015 for the 75th anniversary of the establishment of Australia-U.S. diplomatic relations. Kim Beazley, who kindly serves as a distinguished fellow at our center and was then ambassador to the United States, was hosting it. And it wasn't until halfway through the reception that I, with my poor numerical skills, figured out that 75 years from 2015 would have taken us to 1940. Now, so wait a minute, Federation was in 1940, and yet Australia did not have an embassy in the United States until 1940. So for those of you who don't follow international security affairs, every year in June, the Institute for International Strategic Studies, a London-based think tank, hosts a major security conference at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore. It's not actually up in the mountains in the mystical Shangri-La, it's at the Shangri-La Hotel, right? And now for the 18th year in a row, it has become the preeminent security talk shop, where I think this year there were 18 ministers of defense there. And then there's follower-ons like me, we're groupies, security groupies that kind of come together, and you gather together with several thousand people and you spend 2 days discussing the major security issues of the region. Well, last year, in 2017, the keynote speaker at that Shangri-La dialogue was Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. And he gave a remarkable speech. If you want to address this issue that I'm talking about today in a far more cogent way than I'm giving it to you, I'd urge you just to Google Shangri-La dialogue Malcolm Turnbull and read his speech. Beautifully written. But in that speech, 13 times he made reference to some form of rules-based order. So why is a rules-based order so important to Australia? And one of the reasons is because the opposite of a rules-based order is what? Chaos. It is actually, in some ways, it's might makes right. There was a remarkable opinion piece written in mid-June by David Brooks in the New York Times. David Brooks is what many people call the Democrats' favorite Republican. Right? He's a big think Republican, and the title of this op-ed meant that not nearly enough people paid attention to it. The title was something like "Trump is not playing the game you think he is." But really, what he did in the dialogue, he says, is the big contest of our era is not East versus West, communist versus capitalist, North versus South, whatever. He says it's between high-trust societies and low-trust societies. And his basic argument was this: organizations, institutions, laws, rules, norms, those are all hard to build. They take compromise, they take finesse, they take sophistication and expertise to build, right? And as a result, societies, whether it was the EU itself or NATO or the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement, all these things that are big and complex, and that people don't focus very on, those are all high-trust organizations, high-trust institutions, right? And they're really hard to build, right? The opposite of that is, again, the might makes right, low-trust societies, low-trust institutions. And if you think about those for a second, those are where chaos reigns. If the nuclear non-proliferation treaty becomes null and void, and if a country like North Korea, right, can pull out of the NPT and develop its own nuclear weapons capability, who can? Which country in the world is not more acceptable as a nuclear power than North Korea? If North Korea can do it, Why can't Japan? Why can't South Korea? Why can't Taiwan in the face of pressure? Why not Vietnam with their own concerns about China? Why not the Philippines? Why not Indonesia? And then all of a sudden you get a recognition that from an Australian's perspective, a region when all these countries begin to have this arms race and the capability, that is not in Australia's national interest, right? And so Australia has a direct national interest in maintaining and strengthening that international rules-based order. Seems kind of arcane, but you can see in the case of North Korea how direct that correlation is, why it matters, right? And so, interestingly enough, and I'll just go into this a little bit, we can talk about it more if you want to, but if I'm Australia for the last 2 months now, and I see the United States in a bizarre way, having a summit meeting with North Korea where they get nothing out of the process, where President Trump, from his own ego's and vanity's perspective, gets to have kind of a playhouse summit where he prances and gives full recognition to North Korea, but North Korea does nothing to abandon its nuclear weapons, right? Doesn't give anything up. All of a sudden, from Australia, it's a bizarre situation where our ally, the United States, is undermining that system, the standards, the norms, and regimes that we rely upon so much. So it gives you a sense for the many and multi-layered, complicated issues that fall in this. The second issue I'll talk about where these things overlap is trade, right? Again, many of you may have focused on it or not, but if I can just set a picture for the broad picture here. Australia is one of the most free trade countries in the world, right? Because Australia has tremendous competitive advantage in terms of its basic resources that it exports, commodities, right? Be they wheat, be they coal, be they iron ore, or now LNG. And Australia early recognized either with a population base or whatsoever, it could never compete with the manufacturing powerhouses in the region. And they just recognized that it's national interest were to basically take tariffs to zero, right? Because there's no way they could compete otherwise, right? And so Australia very early on became an ideologically free trade country. It reduced its tariffs, not in negotiations, tit for tat, but just out of a recognition that that was in its national interest, right? In other words, you can have questions, and they're legitimate, to debate about the Australian auto industry and how long we protect it and whether we did or not too. But in the end, all the products that come in tariff-free means that you're not paying those taxes on those products, right? As a nation as a whole, right? But regardless of that, Australia initially was just strongly supportive only of the World Trade Organization, the belief that all nations should reduce tariffs globally, because that's what economists want, right? Well, in the end, the difference between North and South, developed, undeveloped worlds, the World Trade Organization has been stalled for the better part of 15 years. After the Doha round of the World Trade Organization, there really hasn't been any significant movement on global free trade. And in the interim, there have been a whole lot of bilateral free trade agreements. Australia's free trade agreement with the United States, all different ones within the region itself. China has a whole bunch of economic partnership agreements, and it's become what people call the spaghetti bowl. So if you're a businessman and you're trying to deal with something as simple as you build together an iPhone, and there are standards for something like, how do I count this? Is this a Chinese product, or an American product, or a Malaysian product, or a Vietnamese product, or an Australian product, depending on which piece which came from where? There's something called rules of origin, right? Yeah, you've got something complex like that, but if there's 15 different free trade agreements with these 15 different countries, and they all have different rules, all of a sudden it becomes really hard and really complex, and lawyers make a lot of money, right, in terms of that process, right? And so what people basically said is, look, we've got to take that, and since we can't do global, let's do basically multilateral, big mini-lateral, kind of the agreements. And the foremost of these initially started, within ASEAN core members itself, some of them Brunei in Australia and New Zealand and others, has grown into the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement, right? And this is something, to be honest, I watched over the last 15 years of my career grow and develop. And we had this surprise development in February, I guess late January of 2017, when the US president, unilaterally pulled out of the TPP, right? One of his first acts, to me, a stunning act of kind of self-harm in that regard, right? But it did that, and I anticipated, as most people did, that the TPP was dead. that there would be no regional free trade agreement, because without the largest economy and the driver behind the United States, it was a dead deal. To my immense surprise, right, Australia, together with Japan, showed remarkable leadership. I think this is probably the most underreported economic story of the last year. In March of this year, again, with Japanese and Australian leadership, the 11 of the 12 members of the TPP that are not the United States, right, concluded what they call the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the TPP. So the CPTPP. That's what it's called, right? But essentially what it is look, it's not the same thing. It's not entirely the best thing. But in the end, they basically said, our national interest is that we want multilateralism. We want hard. We want complex. We want the sophisticated high trust organizations that bind organizations and countries together. We don't want devolution. We don't want bilateral might makes right in terms of the process. And I just think it's a stunning achievement. Just this week, the negotiators of the TPP countries, or the CPTPP, the TPP 11 or the TPP minus 1, or however you want to call it, right? That group have agreed that next year they will open talks on what other countries can join. So Thailand is going to be high in the rank. Indonesia wants to come in. South Korea should have been in the first place, but for domestic politics. So it gains in momentum, and a massive part of this debate is, do we keep the door open for the United States to come back to sanity or not? But one way or the other, this was Australia, dealing with this delicate balance, advocating its own national interests going forward. So there's one example on the trade side. There's one example that I've talked about on the security side. Let me kind of wrap up by just talking about, again, broad geostrategic developments in the region. And then I'll tie that up into this fundamental question of dragon versus eco for Australia, and I'll end my remarks there. I don't know if you've heard the term Indo-Pacific, or have used it very much. If I had a group of young college students at UWA earlier this year, and I asked them, where do you live? Well, Perth. And I say, not country, not city. What region of the globe do you live in? So a few people said that old term, Australasia, right? A few people said we live in Oceania, right? Oceania is such a weird term for me, if you ask me, right? And finally, after 5 minutes of prodding, somebody said, the Indo-Pacific. So let me talk a little bit about how we think about our position in the world as Australia. When I started my professional career 30 years ago, nobody even used the term Asia-Pacific. We all talked about Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and as I indicated, Australia was part of some mystical land called Oceania. Like it's like Atlantis floating around somewhere with the Kiwis and some islands, right? And that's how organizationally, State Department, Defense Department, other organizations, still countries in Asia still have Oceania divisions, right? They treat Australia and New Zealand separate, right? Just a different way of thinking about the world, right? And at that time, Australia did not consider itself to be part of Asia. But beginning with the late 90s, or the early 90s, late 80s, early 1990s, with the Keating government and others, there was a heavy push to recognize that Australia's future lay in Asia. That Australia was an Asia-Pacific nation. Of course it's Pacific, but it's also in Asia. And so there was this push, and it had a lot of diplomatic manifestations. So in 1993, there was the conclusion of an organization called APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative, which continues today, again, very vibrantly in that regard. Australia joined the East Asia Summit later on and dragged the United States into it. Australia was part of the ASEAN Regional Forum. A lot of with the Pacific Basin Economic Cooperation Council. So at the same time, Australia was pushing for inclusion into Asia. Northeast Asia was recognizing that it wanted to be more integrated with Southeast Asia. And so increasingly there was a new frame of reference, and that became Asia-Pacific. We're not just Asia, it's Asia and the Pacific, right? And that's been the predominant way of describing the region for the last 20 years. Everybody talks about Asia-Pacific. Now, 6-7 years ago when I was still in Washington, D.C., a few Aussies and a couple of academics started talking about Indo-Pacific. I made fun of them. I thought it was a silly academic construct that had no use whatsoever in policy. Because if you take the whole Indian Ocean and its 27 riparian countries, you take the whole Pacific Ocean, it's 2/3 of the world, and what is that, right? It made no sense to me whatsoever, right? So I mocked it, to be very blunt. Well, where you stand is deeply affected by where you sit. Since I've moved to Perth, Australia's Indian Ocean capital, the fulcrum point of the Indo-Pacific, I love Indo-Pacific, right? So my grandson's middle name is Indo-Pacific. All my staff have Indo-Pacific tattoos as we go forward. But in the end, there is some fundamental changes to the way I perceive the world from the way I perceived it when I was sitting in Washington, D.C. Now I'm in Perth, the actual antipodes. In other words, if you drew a hole through the middle of the earth from Washington, it'd be like 200 kilometers off of Augusta down in the south there, right? We are the farthest city on the planet away from Washington, which is actually a really good thing right now. But regardless of that, right? If you look at the world from Australia's perspective, here's my self-serving, but I think accurate reflection. At the start of my professional career, the economic center of gravity was unquestionably in Northeast Asia. The dynamic economies in Japan, Korea, etc., right? Over the last 25 years, the most defining development in the globe that changed everything was the growth of China. Yeah. And so during that last 25 years, the economic center of gravity shifted southwest. Right? So if I were to ask you, what is going to be the defining development of the next 25 years? Well, India, good points, right? But China's still going to be really big, and it's going to be really important. But China's growth is no longer going to be the defining development. What will be the defining development will be the growth of India, but not just India. Remember, ASEAN combined already has 600 million people, right? ASEAN does, right? You've got 270 million people in Jakarta right now. By 2050, PwC estimates there will be 400 million and the fourth largest economy in the world. Right? The economic center of gravity inevitably is going to continue to shift southwest. Now, for us sitting here in Perth, which is the closest western outpost to the new economic center of gravity region, that's a really good thing. It's a really good time to be in Perth. And it's a really good self-rationalization. So why I defected from Washington, D.C. If you look at the news this morning, they just concluded their annual AUSMIN ministerial meetings, what they call the 2+2. These are meetings between Australia's Minister of Defense and U.S. Secretary of Defense, Australia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the U.S. Secretary of State. It just happened in San Francisco. The entire product that came out of that was count squarely in terms of the Indo-Pacific. Again, a victory for Australia is very important. So let me wrap that up into this question then. All right, where do we fit? Australia as a country continues to need those basic strategies to guarantee its own national security. Of course, number one, its own capabilities. And you see this play out in the media every day about Australia's own defensive capabilities, right? Secondly, it needs to have the rules-based order, right? Because in the end, if that order falls apart, it doesn't matter. We're in big trouble in that regard, right? And at least for the time being, it needs a strong alliance relationship with the United States. Now, there has been a very hot debate in the media and public society for the last several years about how do we deal with this tension between Australia's dependence economically on China and its reliance upon the United States for security. Well, it's a couple things. Number one, Australia is not unique in that, right? Every country in the region, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, they all are on the same boat, right? They count on China's growth for economics, development, investment, trade, but they also count upon the United States for security. Now, I would give a little bit of context to that too, because when I arrived in Perth 5 years ago, I made an early decision for the Perth U.S. Asia Center not to focus too much on China. Because at the time, particularly here in Perth, with the mining sector and the resource sector, it was China, right? And I just figured there wasn't a lot of need to do that, right? I didn't need to make the narrative to people that China was important, to pay attention to China. Everybody understood that, right? What I did need to do was make the case, Japan is far more important than you realize. Korea is important. ASEAN is important. Vietnam's important, Indonesia's important, India's important. Those are stories that are not being told nearly enough, right? The Indo-Pacific, those stories aren't being told. The China story, I think, needed to be told in that regard, right? Because it's heavily driven. Because generally, everybody understands trade. They know that Australia's prosperity has been largely dependent upon, shipments of iron ore, which led to this 20-year boom that go to China. China buys our rocks, we get the money, boom, that's great for us, right? You can understand that real, clear, simple narrative. But that narrative is actually a little bit deceptive. So, for example, if I were to ask the average Australian in the street, who is Australia's most important economic partner? Almost unanimously they'd say China, right? But that's only true with trade. Because trade is something that everybody sees, they understand. They don't understand the more complex things around investment. And investment is quite interesting. If you look at U.S. investment in Australia, it is something like 8 times larger than Chinese investment. And more importantly, if you look at the increase in the U.S. investment, the last year we had full measurements, 2 years ago, the increase in the stock of U.S. investment in Australia was greater than the entire stock of Chinese investment. So it's not like a past-present kind of thing, right? And on top of that, if you start looking at the economic impact, actually where the jobs come from, investment is really important because that implies a level of confidence in the system, a level of confidence in the laws, and where you put your money implies a relationship. So we actually did some really interesting studies, and we looked at something that most people don't look at. We looked at sales by Australian majority-owned firms in the United States. And if you look at the dollar value of sales by Australian majority-owned firms in the United States, they are 4 times larger than Australian exports to the United States. We looked at sales by U.S. majority-owned firms in Australia. They are 5 times larger than U.S. exports to Australia. Now, if you put those together, they're at a minimum quadruple the value of trade. Right? And then on top of that, if you look at Australia's relationship with China, right? What do you think the sales are by Australian majority-owned firms in China? There are none, right? And what about the sales by Chinese majority-owned firms in Australia? There's a few, but really, really, really small, right? So that doesn't change that baseline at all. Most of it's portfolio investment or real estate, as you know that well, and a few other kind of high-profile projects, right? Now, I think Chinese investment is fantastic. I think economic integration is fantastic. So I'm not saying that for a second to kind of bash on China. I'm just saying that if you're an Australian citizen, a voter, or more importantly, if you're an Australian policymaker, you're not as dependent on China as you think you are, right? China is big and it's important, but it's really a reflection of the broader integration of the region. And if you look more at things like investment, you have a better understanding of it. So the contest isn't so even-handed as one might actually believe, right? Now, having said that, for the better part of 20 years now, especially the last 10 years, one of the fundamental debates in the region had been this question of how do we deal with the rising China? How do we deal with a China that's growing more powerful and more confident, and they want to set their own rules, and they're not necessarily supportive of the rules-based order? How do we deal with that tension between China's influence and growth and a reliance upon the United States? I've actually always thought of it as a little bit of a false debate, right? There's a lot of people in Canberra that seem to think that America wants Australia to make a choice, and no matter how economically integrated Australia is into China, the U.S. has been there, done that, and smoked a cigarette, right? I mean, the U.S. is far more deeply economically integrated into China than Australia is, by far, right? There's no competition, right? Australia's relationship with China is largely transactional. It's at the border, it's largely commodities. And so there's just not that level of depth of understanding or integration that you would think in terms of that process, right? So I don't think for a second the United States is deeply integrated, is asking someone to make that choice, right? But here's where the more challenging part of this equation comes in. All of a sudden, at least for the last 16 months, there is cause to call into question the U.S. role. The U.S. that had been so steady for so long, right? Whatever mistakes have been made in different issues, you could rely upon the United States to be an advocate for the rules-based global order, that it created, right? That the U.S. would be a strong defender of that liberal rules-based order. That the U.S. would be, the the partner with Australia and strengthen and building those things. And for the last 18 months, that hasn't been the case, right? And so we've all of a sudden, you've got a situation where there's continued concern about the rise of China, influence of China. But it's no longer a simple question of yes or no, China, the US. It's a question of how do we deal with that, plus our own rising anxiety about a US that trashes the G7, that trashes NATO, that doesn't seem to understand alliances, that clearly doesn't like anything multilateral, that doesn't seem to like things that are not might makes right? All of a sudden, it puts Australia in a very strange situation. On the one hand, recognizing that Trump is not the United States, that there's a broader situation, and that one day this will end, right? At the same time, you got to deal with it, right? And so what is the answer? The answer is that countries are looking for partners to help mitigate the risk. They're hedging. So why is Japan so keen to have a strong relationship with Australia? Because it's got the same basic concerns. Why is India in that regard? At the Shangri-La dialogue, it was strange this year. You had both the British and the French saying, woo, we're Indo-Pacific powers. And you're like, wow, that's great. Welcome back, guys, right? But the whole idea is because they're also realizing they need partners. Last year in November, Minister of Finance Matthias Cormann, through sheer strength of will, managed to convince the German Business Consortium, the Business Council, to bring their annual Asia-Pacific conference to Perth, right? So we ended up having a German president and 2,000 German businesses here in Western Australia. And all of a sudden, the Germans are like, we're keen to work with Australia and everything. Why? Because we need friends. We need partners. And so at least in the interim, there's going to be a little bit more multipolarity. There's going to be effort to hedge until we figure out kind of what's going on in the United States in terms of that process. But again, hopefully that, I've covered a lot of ground, a lot of different issues, and I've used too much of my time, I'm afraid. But hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the geopolitical, geostrategic shifts that are taking place, how we can look at it from a perspective here in Perth, and from an Australian national security perspective. So with that, I'll end my remarks, and I don't know if we have a couple minutes for a question and answer, or do you want to?
Yes. Thank you for a very illuminating talk, Professor. One question in relation to the rules-based order. How do you see the role of China versus other countries in the South China Sea?
And here I'll be very even-handed on this issue. China in the South China Sea has deliberately ignored and tried to subvert the rules-based order. One of the problems in the South China Sea is these disputes are eons old. They've been going back for hundreds of years. And one of the things that really brought them to a head was in 1994 when the UN concluded the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that defined in law, international law, quite clearly what constitutes an island, what constitutes a rock, what gives you territoriality, what gives you an exclusive economic zone. So all of a sudden, once that happened, all these countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, the claimant states, Taiwan, and of course China, began to assert their claims more forcefully, right? Now, in 1994, there wasn't much that China could do. With every passing year, as China's got stronger and stronger and stronger, it has had both the economic, technological, political, diplomatic, military capability to do more. So China is doing more in terms of building whole islands out of scratch, where there's just an underwater reef, they build an island on top of it, putting airstrips on there, putting missile sites on there, militarizing the region, all in direct contravention of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. In fact, there have been international tribunals the year before last that came to that conclusion. But in the end, what it comes right down to, it is might makes right. So if you refer back to that Prime Minister Turnbull's speech from last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, a good chunk of what he's focusing on is the South China Seas, right? Now, here's where I'm being fair about this. The United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? And refused any effort at multilateral negotiations. The United States wants bilateral free trade agreements. Why do you think the US wants bilateral if you're Trump, right? Big dog, small dog, right? You get to push people around. If you have a bilateral agreement, you can force what you want. Multilateral, you're dealing with 12 other countries, it's too hard and they can gang up against you, right? So Japan, which was a leader in the TPP, has refused to have a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States. And not surprisingly, when the US quickly, thanks to Greg Norman, gave Australia, an exemption from, steel and aluminum tariffs, and quickly negotiated Korean backing down on this and a few others, right? They have not been willing to give any exemption to Japan. Why? They're trying to pressure Japan into a bilateral free trade agreement that it does not want. Right? That is the same thing we're accusing China of doing in the South China Seas. Denying, eschewing, multilateral agreements, rules-based order and law in favor of might makes right. And so we call it out with China and the South China Seas. Likewise, we should call it out with the U.S. and trade activities right now.
Just wondering, is the rules-based order a Western construct? Like, in other words, would China think it had a rules-based order that's just different from how we do things?
So to answer that, I'll tell you, I had a long series of discussions in the policy planning division of the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs 2 months ago. And this issue came up. They said, well, can't we just have a rules-based order under China? And the problem there comes to this fundamental question of what do we mean by rule of law? So years ago, 20 years ago when I was in Washington, one of the things the think tank I ran there did is we developed a lexicon explaining what we mean by rule of law. Right? Because Chinese have a word for rule of law, it's fa zhi. Koreans have one, bok chi, right? But they're missing a very important participle there, right? Which is, actually, I don't know if it's a part of it, I hope there's no English teachers here, I can't remember, but what is the word of? Whatever the part of the speaking was, rule of law, right? Because there's a big difference between rule of law or rule by law, right? Rule of law implies that law governs the government. Rule by law is what you have in China. It implies that the party uses the law to rule the people, right? The law is not above the party. Does that make sense? The party is supreme. And again, you can debate that one way or the other, but the question I ask my friends in Korea is, all right, if you want a rules-based order, do you think that China is subject to that law? Are they using that law to rule the region, right? Do you want rule of law or do you want rule by law in terms of it, right? Because again, China, interesting enough, the United States, stupidly, is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, but abides by it almost universally, right? China is a signatory to the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, but violates it, right? And so they recognize the law, but they don't recognize the law's applicability to the party. It's not above them, right? And so that fundamental question of the rule of law is a big issue. Now, there are many other areas where China has been compliant, and in fact, one of the interesting things about that op-ed I referred to in terms of high trust societies, low trust societies, is that David Brooks did not put China in the Putin-Erdogan camp. And I think that's a good opening, right? China is not, a destructive actor. They need stability. They need institutions to thrive. So for whatever our problems we have with them, we actually have more in common with China than we do with Erdogan or Putin or Duterte, right? In that process, right? And so, again, not perfect, but relative. So that's helpful.
Thanks very much. Fabulous talk. It's probably another whole presentation, but I was wondering if you might be prepared to make a short comment in terms of US, China, Australia's position around science and technology. Because the race for being at the forefront of science and technology, they talk about the innovative world of the future. There's races there going on as well. I was wondering if you could provide some brief commentary on that.
You're right, it is an entire range of issues, but let me just highlight some of the real key questions, and maybe I'll end with that because I know we're taking up more time. Obviously in this, questions of espionage are really important in terms of are they locally developed or are they stolen, right? Because they are real, which is why there's a really big debate internally in Australia right now, in the United States right now, in terms of how technologies are developed, how they're obtained, how they're protected, how they're guarded, intellectual property, all those things related to that. So that is one set of issues that cannot be separated from that discussion. Resourcing is another set of issues, right? When you've got a state that's willing to kind of pump in tons and tons of money into it, that gives you resources, which is going to be difficult for democratic societies, like Australia and the United States to meet. Then you get to the question of, is it the role of the private sector, or is it the role of the government sector to kind of develop these things, etc. In general, I'm someone who believes that there's a correlation between freedom and free enterprise and innovation, right? And the best things are going to come out of that process. It's very difficult to mandate, innovation, creativity, etc. And I think that shows in terms of that process. But having said that, in an environment where things can be bought, right? There is a real competition, and really importantly, there's a whole other layer of issues that we can't get into right now that come with the implications. And so, if you're talking about, say, post-Fukushima, Japan and the U.S. all pull out of the nuclear industry, right? Who then sets the laws for safety, non-proliferation stuff on nuclear? China. I haven't answered the question, just to tell you it's really complex, and there are many different attributes of that, which will leave for another lecture maybe one day. Let's say I'm angling for an invite back next year. I know I've gone on too long.
No,
not at all. No, we'd like to see you later. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And thank you for stepping up so early and so cheerfully.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.